Hey, so I think it's a bit of a cliche at this point. I mean, obviously, hi, congratulations on making it here, all that sort of stuff. It should be fun. I think it's a bit of a cliche at this point, but uh, Jerusalem will remain the capital of Israel. That's almost undeniable. At least East Jerusalem. The cradle of government is there. The Supreme Court is there. Majority of MPs live in the area, and it's about 70% Jewish. And that's been true for a very long time, and it's very unlikely that the peace process ends with Israel giving up that region. What this does is establish facts on the ground that are irrevocable and acknowledge the reality of the situation. So, in terms of what we're debating about, obviously we're debating about, I think the fairest definition is the act of moving the US embassy to Jerusalem being defined as the thing that Trump just did, which is announce and plan a timetable for the movement of the embassy, just in the sense that grounds this debate in a more real world context and doesn't really have too many niggly little doubts to it. I'm going to articulate a couple of reasons why I think that's good for the peace process. Obviously, you might think that's good or bad for other reasons. They're irrelevant to this debate. It's exclusively about the peace process. The first and most important reason that this is good for the peace process is that it shifts the mindset of the Palestinians, and particularly the Palestinian Authority. The essential claim here is that they have been assuming quite consistently that they're capable of establishing a system of government that does not involve Palestine occupying any space in Israel. Some of them do that because not Israel, in Jerusalem. Some of them do that because they believe it genuinely. Others do it because they recognize that it gives them an advantage in negotiating because it shifts the goalposts further in Palestine's direction. What this does essentially is establish beyond all doubt that at least East Jerusalem is going to remain in Israeli hands and is going to remain the capital of Israel, which is something that was never really contentious. And in doing so, shifts the internal debate and shifts the necessary public positions of Palestine away from that extreme position and moves the two positions closer together. The second thing to say is that it shrinks the negotiating positions of the two parties. So this is similar for Palestine to what I described. I showed you how it shifts their mindset and disabuses them of some notions that are implausible. But in addition to that, it also shifts the negotiating position of Israel because Trump, in giving them this, acknowledged a set of things like Jerusalem was not an undivided city, or they did not have absolute right to the area, or there would not be an absolute or that the contiguous land border would not remain in exactly the same way. So making Israel's leaders celebrate a statement that included a number of concessions to reality in that way also binds them politically. And the final thing that it did is that it reestablished the negotiating comity with the US and Israel. I'll establish that a little bit more in my second speech.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and talk about a couple of big issues that I think you've at least agreed to primarily, being that currently on the ground, Israel does control West and East Jerusalem. The problem is that control of East Jerusalem is actually illegal, and that's what the Palestinians are really concerned about. Let's go ahead and talk about 3 points about why this is going to harm the peace process. First point is that this is a boneheaded move. The point is this is something that really actually harms Trump and the US's entire negotiating positions. Because subpoint A is that this is the most contentious issue. This is the site of the holy sites for three major religions. Both sides want to have Jerusalem as their capital, whether West or East. It was the basic nexus of the wars that happened in 1948 and on the Eastern Front in 1967. It's probably the biggest issue for both sides in this entire process. Who controls Jerusalem? Subpoint B is that it shows bias. It's an unequivocal acceptance of Israel's claim to have both West and East Jerusalem. That's something that clearly shows that the US is biased toward Israel as against the Palestinians. Subpoint C is that it is a gift to Israel. No concession was required of Israel, and no concession was given to the Palestinians in regard to this. This was just a gift from Israel, a gift from US, of recognizing Israel's claim in this area. But there was nothing that we got from it that's actually going to help peace. But that leads us to contention two, which is that if the Palestinian back out, there are going to be a couple subpoints to this one again. Subpoint A is that a position of weakness. The problem with the Palestinian negotiating position right now is that they start from a position of weakness because Israel occupies their territory and has everything they want. Everything that the Palestinians want, whether that's West Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, or the West Bank, is controlled by Israel. Israel has all the cards except the international opinion. So when you have the international opinion going toward Israel, when you have the US supporting Israel, you're putting the Palestinians even more into a position of weakness that's going to harm their negotiating ability. But subpoint B is that of the Palestinian rejection. Now, according to The Guardian, today, the Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, declared that they will reject any role for the US in the peace process to come. And Israel has declared, according to the Jerusalem Post, that they will only work with the US in negotiating peace to come. So what you have there is an absolute roadblock. Neither side is going to be able to work together because they won't work with an intermediary. They won't work with the same intermediary. The one that Israel chooses, Palestine rejects, and the others that Palestine would use, Israel rejects. So we seriously cannot have peace when they're not going to even talk together. Subpoint C is that of a declaration of war. The Palestinian representative to the UK described the move of the embassy as this. He described it as a kiss of death to the two-state solution. He is declaring war on the Middle East. He is declaring war against 1.5 billion Muslims and hundreds of millions of Christians that are not going to accept the holy shrines to be totally under the hegemony of Israel. There'll be some other points I'm going to get to in my next speech, and I'm going to respond directly to some of your points.
Okay, I want to respond first to this idea that it's boneheaded because it weakens the negotiating position of the United States. The first overarching response to this, and a thing that I'll consistently come back to, is that the United States could already largely not play this role. I think the easiest way to understand this intuitively is that the United States provides all of the weaponry that Israel uses to maintain the blockade against the Palestinian people and all of the bombs that Israel uses to drop in retaliatory strikes. In addition, they're allied with a host of nations who have claimed repeatedly the United States is an evil nation, and most Palestinian leaders have made claims to that effect. Like the idea that the US was ever going to be seen as an unbiased moderator in this setting is ludicrous. Trivially, that wasn't true, but particularly when it's a Republican administration, the Republican Party that Donald Trump belongs to, and critically Mike Pence belongs to, are religiously fanatic in their belief that Israel is more important than Palestine. So I think that this is a benefit with literally nowhere to go. You couldn't make it worse because Israel is already sufficiently understanding of this harm. Let's talk about the second thing, the specifics. You say, oh, it's really important. Well, yes, but it's more important to Israel than to Palestine. That is to say, it buys more goodwill with Israel than it damages with Palestine. It's important to understand that, and this is probably the substantive that I forgot to get to. Israel actually was not getting along very well with the United States and was increasingly acting out violently against Palestine in the back end of the Obama administration because of some relatively minor diplomatic scurries, as well as an indication that he'd reduced the amount of military support that he was giving them. This is a clear signal that solidly gets the US government and Israel back allied, which then means that the kind of negotiations that were able to happen, for instance, with President Bill Clinton, in which there was an assumption of good faith on the part of the Palestinians, on the part of the Israelis, and a willingness to collaborate with US strategies, was more likely. When that relationship is seen to be one that's trusting, as this has established, like they want to name a fucking train station after Donald Trump, that's more likely to happen. And it's more important to Israel than it is to Palestine because the Palestinians do not care as much about this issue. Like they say they do. You can't really trust their public statements because they're trying to discourage Donald Trump from doing this thing because they obviously don't want it. But the Palestinians are more concerned with the material facts on the ground, like the fact that they have a blockade that is stopping them getting access to pharmaceuticals or selling food to the international market, or the fact that they consistently have rockets fired down upon them. And yes, it shows bias, but that's already true at the moment. And it's a gift to Israel, but all that has done is reestablish the links that have been made there. The final thing that I want to talk about is the idea that they're in a weak negotiating position, but Palestine was already in a really weak negotiating position, and the US was already the weak link in that chain. You know, like they were the most favorable, so it's unclear what the benefit there is.
Okay, let's go into those issues again. Starting out, I'm going to provide my third point, which was about the world condemnation of this issue. Now, the UN recently passed a resolution saying that 128 states supported it, 35 abstaining and 9 against, which said that basically you can't do anything about Jerusalem. We declare it all null and void, status quo as it is, and negotiate peace treaty from there. They condemned the action pretty much overwhelmingly. And this was actually something that led Benjamin Netanyahu to say that the UN was a house of lies, further solidifying the fact that he's not going to work with other people other than the US. So point B is that of international law. The Oxford Hub for Human Rights says that in regard to Jerusalem, there have been multiple UN resolutions, including the famous Resolution 242 passed in the wake of the Six-Day War, an International Court of Justice decision that occupation was illegal, and a Supreme Court ruling saying that the decision about Jerusalem can't be unilaterally, because doing so would wreck the peace process. The point is this: internationally and legally, Israel doesn't have a claim to East Jerusalem, and recognizing that and the Palestinians' position, but also the entire world's position as a negotiator trying to get peace. So let's go back into the arguments that my opponent has provided. His first couple of arguments that he provided in the first speech was that it was going to shift the mindset of the Palestinian Authority. I have two responses to this. First, they know it's illegal under international law, and they're not going to give that up. But secondly, it's their biggest issue, as I already pointed out. The Jerusalem issue is like the biggest issue in the entire set of issues that govern the whole Palestinian-Israeli peace process. And as I've already pointed out, according to President Abbas, that's a pretty big deal, and they're not going to negotiate with the U.S. over it. And secondly, he talked about how it's going to shift the negotiation point for Israel, because Israel's going to have favors to make up. Well, the problem is this didn't give anything to the Palestinians and didn't require anything from Israel. It wasn't part of a deal. It was just a great gift, as I explained in my third subpoint under my first contention. This is something that you don't do in a negotiating position when you're really trying to get peace, is trying to incense the one party while giving a gift to the other one. That's just not good logic, and that's not good diplomacy. He said in response to my first contention that the U.S. maybe shouldn't be playing a role here, but as I pointed out, the U.S. is the only one that Israel's going to negotiate with. So if there wants to be peace, you've got to have the U.S. involved. He talked about how we're obviously biased toward Israel, but the point is this making us more biased toward Israel. Trump was going to say that he was going to make a deal of all deals, and the Palestinians were probably at least willing to listen. But then when you do this, it takes us completely off the table. And finally, we talked about the weak negotiating position, and his response to that was already weak. That's exactly the point. The point I'm making is that without this problem, when we see this position right now, it's super weak, and the only thing we can do about it is use international pressure to get that result. What we're doing now is not using that, we're actually making the problem worse.
Okay, so I think the question that I have at about the halfway mark of this debate is that it's unclear what strategy my opponent thinks is going to work in terms of enticing both parties to the table and giving them the requisite incentives to stay there. My claims are that this has modified the mindset of Palestinians because it has acknowledged the eternal primacy of the Jerusalem maintaining its place as the capital. And if he's right, and that's the most important issue, then changing their minds and persuading them that the world's largest military power supports their consistent claim to the idea that they have East Jerusalem as their capital seems relevant there, which then shrinks the negotiating positions that Palestine needs to engage in and makes the negotiations simpler and less easy to be tripped up by extremists on both sides who don't want to see that sort of thing occurring. Also, unresponded to, it traps Israel in acknowledging and celebrating a variety of Trump's claims that reject some of the more extreme versions of Israeli nationalism that members of the Knesset have been pointing to. And finally, he misunderstands the third mechanism because he says that it's a gift. But of course, diplomacy involves gifts all the time. It's not entirely zero sum, particularly between nations that have historic alliances that are often tested in fast-paced periods. More important than gifts is establishing, or in this circumstance, re-establishing instances of goodwill. And that's why Israel is more keen to have the US involved in those negotiations. That then means that the US is able to prod Israel into making other sorts of concessions. The claims that we essentially get here are international pressure is likely to work, but it's not, because Israel does not need to care that much about international pressure. The BDS movement does not cost it very much academically or economically, although it does cost them something, and the US gives them more than enough aid to make up for it. And otherwise, international condemnation has literally done nothing for the past 20 years because the Israeli population doesn't trust those people. It's unclear why that matters. International law is literally a relevant architect that has no coercive power. And given that he thinks that so much of diplomacy is zero sum, it's unclear why the Israelis would respect it. He asserts that it's the most important issue and it's likely to totally block anything from happening for Palestine. Okay, if this is true, if it's true that it's the most important issue, then peace is impossible because Israel is never going to leave either. It's not going to leave Jerusalem. And as is acknowledged, Israel doesn't need to give up Jerusalem. They're more powerful in every way, right? So he needs to walk a very thin line between saying that it's the most important issue, but also they'd be willing to make massive concessions, but not this one concession of having the US embassy in there. And that obviously is not an accurate characterization. They're probably going to be willing to make concessions once they've been forced to acknowledge, and successive cycles of politicians have been forced to acknowledge that they're not getting all of Jerusalem back and they need to come to some form of compromise.
Okay, just to be exceedingly clear about what my opponent is advocating for. He's advocating for recognizing the illegal occupation under international law of a foreign power of another nation's territory, of a territory that's wholly to them as their faith demands, a territory that they claim as their very capital. He's suggesting that we should acknowledge the foreign power's occupation of that territory as their capital. And the best way to get to peace is to recognize and sanction this violation of international law, and by that, the current violation of human rights that are occurring in those occupied territories. The simple fact is that East Jerusalem is under a military occupation of the Israeli state right now, and just giving a gift by harming the Palestinian cause is not something that's going to lead to peace. It's certainly not a peace that's going to end up in a two-state solution. The Palestinians have made this exceedingly clear. My opponent asserts that the Palestinian Authority is going to be in an easier negotiating position because we're going to harm their chances at their most important objective, that is East Jerusalem. So if it is, it's very important for both sides. We can clearly agree to that. That's self-evident. But the problem is when that one side owns it, that turns the other side completely off. That's why the international community has chosen not to recognize Jerusalem as either state's actual capital, because to say so is to harm their chances of getting any kind of concession from the other side. So then the issue becomes, if Israel will never leave Jerusalem and Palestine doesn't want to give up Jerusalem, then where are we going to get this whole concession from? That's the point that my opponent's hammering. He says that if both sides really want it, then we need to give it to one side and hope the other side gives up that. That's unfortunately never going to happen. If you actually look at the facts, if you look at the statistics I provided and the quotes from people like the Palestinian Authority that he hasn't addressed at all, they're saying they're not going to work with the U.S. and Israel's not going to work with anybody but the U.S. And they're really mad about the fact that that they've made this decision. So the question then becomes, if neither side is willing to come to the table, when you have this decision made, if one of the sides, is not willing to come to the table, when you make this decision, then why would you think that this decision furthers peace? This is actually something that my opponent hasn't engaged with. The fact that the Palestinian Authority has claimed they're not going to come to the table with the U.S. because of this decision. The fact is, Israel has been the U.S. ally, and the U.S. has supported Israel in the past. But we have a chance until Trump decides that he's going to give this thing to Israel. That's a bad decision, and it's not going to help peace.
Okay, so at the end of that, it's incredibly clear that he thinks actually that peace is literally impossible, because Israel is not going to move the Knesset, its seat of government, and the 70% of the population that it holds, of the Jerusalem population, into other areas of Israel. And apparently that's an illegal settlement that we should not acknowledge at any cost, and the Palestinians are never going to give up on, and is never able to be a part of it. Which means, really, just on balance of numbers, if he thinks it's totally impossible, and I reckon there's like a chance that something can happen with the disruption, then we're just kind of out of chaos theory win this debate. But critically, he's mischaracterized at several key points. So both occupation of East and West Jerusalem are regarded as illegal technically under international law, but in reality, it's the seizure of West Jerusalem that occurred far later on. The only thing that Trump's idea proclaims is not the idea of an undivided Jerusalem, it's the idea that East Jerusalem remains the capital of the Israeli government. And most governments around the world have given de facto support of that and have not taken strong international steps like the introduction of sanctions, or even, in fact, a willingness to sanction them in UN resolutions. Those are things that are reserved for ideas about West Jerusalem. Also, critically, there are many holy sites like the Wailing Wall that Arabs already hold access to and could potentially be more easily traded away in the negotiation. So it's not like it's a MacGuffin in this debate. But what it does acknowledge is that the Palestinians are not going to get access to everything. They're not going to get access to every single thing in the city. That's just to clear that up. I thought that was clear at the start, but it genuinely appears that that is not clear to my opponent, because that obviously changes the character of the arguments that they make. I then want to engage in just another question that befuddles me about the opposition's case, because another thing that Palestine always says is that the right of return is like irrevocable and must never be taken away. And Israel has said that it will never support the right of return. It would rather kill people who try to enter without permits and things like that. Another thing they say is that the pre-settlement borders need to be pre-established, even though there are 500,000 Israelis in the area. So the question that I have for my opponent is, if that's all true, and if the US is still willing to support Israel after those things that are illegal and stuff, and they're still able to go into negotiations after that process, why is Palestine willing to do it? And that's because in reality, those things are strong motivators for Palestine, but they're not as strong as the fact that Israel's blockade keeps them in poverty, keeps them at fairly serious threat of war constantly, and gives them almost no democratic rights. I think that the US is still able to play the card of being able to fix all of those problems. And even though this is another provocation, I think Palestine's already essentially maxed out its outrage. It hates the US so much. There's nowhere else for them to go. And they've still been negotiating for all this time because they know that the US is an effective negotiator. But as I've shown you, this massively makes Israel more favorably to the position of America, which means they might be more effective at that negotiation.
Okay, I think there's a lot of confusion with my opponent because he's stating some blatantly wrong things. For example, West Jerusalem is actually not illegally occupied. East Jerusalem is illegally occupied. West Jerusalem is completely okay, and pretty much everybody acknowledges that when there's a peace deal, Israel can have West Jerusalem as their capital. They can keep the Knesset there. They can keep all the Jewish people there. That's not a problem at all. And the proclamation from Trump does not actually recognize West Jerusalem as the capital, but recognizes the entirety of Jerusalem as the capital. If you can read it, if you'd like to read it, feel free. There's no mention of East Jerusalem or West Jerusalem, at least from what I remember, in the entire proclamation. It just recognizes Jerusalem as the capital. So this is actually a complete recognition of Israel's illegal occupation of East Jerusalem as well as West Jerusalem. So this is definitely not something that's actually recognizing facts on the ground as much as recognizing Israel's version of what they want and giving that to Israel straight up. So at the end of this whole question, what I have to ask is, how do we best get peace? The assertion from my opponent is that the best way to get peace, the best way for us as the Israeli or the Palestinians to actually achieve peace is for us to give a massive concession to Israel and then hope that the Palestinians are going to not hate us enough after that, that they will come to the table and give up their most important issues in exchange for something like the termination of the blockade. Now, this simply isn't actually what the evidence shows us. If we look at the examples I provided and the evidence that I cited, which I can post in the links if you'd like to see it, the Palestinians are rejecting this and they're saying they're not going to work with America. Previously, they were willing to work and now they aren't. If that doesn't tell you that the peace process is being harmed by this declaration, I don't know what is. If you can't even get one of the parties to the table, then I don't know how that's going to help the peace at all. Now, the whole argument that he's making is based on speculation, when we actually have evidence that the Palestinians aren't going to engage following this decision. So what I want to see from my opponent at some point is the actual evidence, the actual statements, the actual citations of these people who are involved in the process on the Palestinian or the Israeli side, talking about how they're going to react and how they are now going to be pushing more for peace or being willing to accept more on the Palestinian side thanks to this decision. The fact is, this clearly shows the U.S. is biased towards Israel and they're giving them stuff without any requirement in return. If you want peace, there needs to be a deal. But what this is doing is making a deal impossible. Currently, before this decision happened, they were willing to come to the table, but now they aren't. And that's something that hasn't been addressed.
Okay. My opponent gets lazy towards the end there and says, oh, well, what you need to do is provide quotations from Israel and Palestine about what their negotiating strategies are. I mean, to look at his briefly, of course, Palestine would make claims that they're going to blow off negotiations if America does this because they don't want it to happen and they want to create the maximalist disincentive for them to do so. They made similar claims when the US rearmed Israel in 2006 under the Bush administration. And they came back to the table 3 years later. They're savvy negotiators who don't always say the things that they believe. If you want evidence on the Israel side, well, you can read virtually anything that Benjamin Netanyahu has said about it being a historic and great day for Israel that has substantially strengthened the relationship between the United States and Israel and has made Israel substantially more willing to negotiate in that setting. Or, hell, you could just go out and look at the fact they want to name a train station after Trump for being willing to do this. They're thrilled about it. And at this point, it becomes relevant to note just the critical mischaracterizations that my opponent consistently makes of my case. He says we're giving them something without giving them anything, without getting anything in return. Well, as I showed you, diplomacy doesn't need to work that way. You're able to give people, yes, gifts, if you want to call them that, establish goodwill, and then behave that way later on. He says it's the most important issue, so Palestine is never going to be able to change their position. If Palestine originally believed that all of the city of Jerusalem should be under their possession. And now apparently what we're hearing is that they're very comfortable giving up West Jerusalem. It is true. I mixed up the two words there, but all of the analysis that I provide does fit in. West Jerusalem is where the seat of government is and stuff like that. And critically, it is very contentious. Palestine reckons that an undivided Jerusalem is going to be their seat of government, and that is the position they're sticking to, and that is what has all the religious significance, and that is the kind of thing that is likely to be supported. You change that position, you make it clear that that negotiation is not going to go forward with that item in there, and you make it easier to resolve that clash. And then in return, you make it easier to resolve the other clashes because the negotiation is less complex and is less easy to be blown up by whichever of the two sides hardliners find it easier to negotiate with. At the end of this, actually, no, I'll just give myself another minute to respond to my opponent. But at the end, what I think I should stress is that the status quo is failing, and the status quo is one that is relied on international law and appeasement of both sides and treatment of equals. By marginally shifting the goalposts and being able to get pretty radical concessions from one side, we're able to move the two parties together and accomplish the mutually guaranteed goal of peace.
Okay. This entire thesis is that what my opponent's supporting is the fact that by taking away something that the other part, one party is super concerned about and giving it straight up to the other party, that's somehow going to change the debate and make them more likely to come to the table. I don't think so. The most important issue that I think we could, that I know of, that I've read about, is the issue of who owns Jerusalem. It's the issue of who owns East Jerusalem that's an issue, because Israel has occupied it. The Palestinians don't really want West Jerusalem. What they want is East Jerusalem. So what they want is this Jerusalem. Israel wants the undivided Jerusalem. By giving them the embassy, Trump in his proclamation will recognize Jerusalem undivided as the capital of Israel. So what he's saying there then is that Israel has this entire thing. That's something that makes the Palestinians really mad, as I already explained. And that's something that they're not going to come to the table after that. I'm all for trying to come to peace, but what we shouldn't do to come to peace is to reject things that are working, that are bringing both parties to the table by giving an enormous concession, perhaps the most important concession, to one side. The side that is in the position of power already, and the side that controls everything the other side wants. What we need to do in order to address this entire issue, in order to solve this problem, in order to help both sides, is work from a position of neutrality and work from a position of trying to bring both sides to the table by recognizing what they want and not giving enormous concessions right off the top, unconditionally, to one side or the other. That's what this position does, and that's what changing the embassy to Jerusalem did. That's not a good negotiating position. It's condemned and it's violating international law. Diplomacy certainly can work, but not in the case where you're going and giving away the most important issue without getting anything in return.
Okay. I'll cite the quote later on because I've got it up on my webpage right now and I was reading it beforehand. All that Trump's thing asserts is that Jerusalem is the cradle of Israel's government, not that a single city. And in fact, this is the thing that I was referring to right at the start of my case. Trump's statement explicitly concedes that negotiations over the boundaries between Jerusalem and Palestine that cross Palestine and Israel that cross into Jerusalem will need to be negotiated as part of a peace deal. Trump is the one who has locked in Israeli dealers to not believing in a single city.
Okay, so basically the issue is, from what I got in my opponent's last speech, the issue of who owns the city and what Trump's proclamation really did. Now, regardless of what Trump's proclamation did, it did not recognize West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. It recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. That's exactly what Israel wants, and that's exactly what the Palestinians cannot accept. One side cannot accept this deal, and the other side is enthusiastic about it. That's not a good position for negotiation. Basically, at the end of this round, what I see as the most important issue is this. By recognizing this, the United States put the side that's in a position of power, even in more power over the other one. And that's something that the other side is really mad about, and they're refusing to come to the table about it. That's something my opponent hasn't really addressed, and that's something that's critically important. Peace can't happen when one side rejects it. And one side rejecting it is exactly what's happened